Is this working? I hope so. Okay, so this one will be on narrative therapy. So for narrative therapy, I've credited Michael White and David Epstein. That's not a complete list of people who are really influential of narrative. You have White, Epstein, Freeman Combs, and later Madigan. But I would say let's stick with Michael White for now, for you being theoretically introductory learners into narrative practice. So Michael White was Australian, grew up, loved bicycle riding, and really thought that that exemplified freedom. And so he talks about in the beginning of this book how maps provided him that freedom. So being able to say, I want to go here, I could go this path or that path or this path. And so he essentially, remember, everybody has their model and they're kind of themselves by certain principles, and then afterwards people like what they did, and then they start to kind of like market that, I suppose, to pass it on to other people so they can mimic what they're doing. So in this book, you have his original influence in like the philosophy and like Foucault, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then over time, you have him creating actual like maps that he can pass along to people so that they can mimic his practice. But I believe he didn't even necessarily want to create those, but it was kind of demanded of him by people who wanted to be more like him and do what he does. So you need to know a little bit about Foucault. It'd be great if you know a lot about Foucault, but not necessary. So Foucault was really interested in power in civilization and power dynamics, and he was really anti the medical gaze. And the medical gaze is treating people as a bunch of organs rather than as individuals. So the example that I give that isn't the best example, but we're going with it, is Bob. And like back in the day, we would treat Bob as just like different. He's like, that's just Bob, don't worry about it. He's a part of our society. And then we started saying, well, actually, Bob is crazy. There's something wrong with Bob. So we took Bob out of society and isolated him and treated him differently in order to, quote, fix him. So the societal structure that's determining, you know, who is crazy and who needs to be kind of like taken out to be treated is something that Foucault's really interested in. And then of course Michael White is interested in that, and that will show up with the idea of externalization, and we'll talk about that in a second. I don't want to give you too much on just one slide. And then Tom Anderson remembers the reflecting team guy. So the same person who influenced Harleen and Harry Galician also influenced Michael White. Okay, and then this slide is going to be your introduction to narrative terminology. So narrative relies on social constructionism. So remember, you have general systems theories, you have natural systems theory, which is just Bowen, and then you have language systems theory. So those are your three MFT theories, and the ones that you're going to focus on in language systems are all going to abide by social constructionism. So the three most popular that you are likely already exposed to, solution focused, narrative, and collaborative, are all language systems models that focus on social constructionism. So social constructionism, if you kind of back up a level, is a form of postmodernism. So postmodernism just means that you believe in multiple realities, and then social constructionism means that you believe that those realities are created in a society. And so language systems, it's important for you to know, it's not just that language is important, it's that language creates. Language is constructive. So not everybody can get behind that, but I think if you can, it's pretty great. Okay, and then narrative is also focused on someone's lived experience. So going back to phenomenology, you're really interested in a more in-depth appreciation of an individual rather than a more superficial understanding of a lot of people. So narrative is most well known for externalization, and externalizing is often not what you think it is. It's like a lot of people teach a more kind of superficial understanding of externalization as just kind of a technique, but it really is grounded in the whole model. So you can't separate it from the philosophy. So externalization is coming from this idea of the person is not the problem is the problem, which again goes like back to its Foucault roots. So you're using these metaphors to pull whatever the problem is out of the person so that they can see it as not them. I'm not explaining this the best. I guess it's saying like the person is not broken. So you can't fix the person because they're not broken, but you will kind of analyze the problem and see how the person can be in relation to the problem. So there is an example that I'm going to try to not mess up. Okay, so there's an example of a little boy who has ADHD. And he comes in with both of his parents, heteronormative situation. Dr. White, I don't know, Michael White, approaches them and asks about the ADHD. He realizes that the son doesn't have ADHD, he has AHD. So the son doesn't have the acronym right. And the parents are really concerned with, again, fixing this ADHD. But instead, Michael White explores how AHD is affecting this boy. So what is happening in his life? How is it affecting him? And then he asks him, like, what does your AHD look like? And he's like, I don't know. And he's like, oh, of course, like, it makes sense that your AHD has been able to run amok, causing all of these problems because you don't know what he looks like. So how can you identify when he's there, etc., etc. He gets to a place where he talks about how AHD wants to be like his only friend and that he's taking him away from other things. So again, a way of externalization, you're using this metaphor. The part where I was saying a lot of people kind of misuse or misunderstand externalization is having the assumption that it's a combative metaphor. And so Michael White like directly addresses that, I think, in Maps, and says it's interesting that everybody thinks that externalization is only combative. For instance, like the example would be like you have to kill AHD, you have to like battle him and defeat him, sort of a thing. He says that of all his examples, I think it was in Maps, like up until the point where he had written whatever it was, we're pretending that it was Maps, that he only had one example that he had published about using a combative metaphor. But I think it might be one of the things where, in explaining it to someone, it's like the fastest explanation to say, oh, how are you going to overcome, defeat some sort of almost like war-like situation, so it's easier for people to understand, and then they kind of run with that and think that is like the way that you do it, and that's really not the common way to do it at all. Okay, so that's enough ranting on that. So the whole idea of narrative is you see people essentially as a character in a story. So what you're doing, your role as the therapist, is to re-author with them. So it's re-authoring, it's called restorying, and it's also co-authoring. So the idea is not that you are telling them what to think or what their story is, and you're waiting to see if they accept it. You're really creating this new dialogue together. And I'll go into that, well, maybe I'll do that now. Okay, sorry, I'll do a long rant now. Okay, so with the stories, you have the dominant story, and then you have the subordinate story. And these names like slightly change as narrative evolves and more people start talking about it. So you can have the dominant discourse and the subjugated discourse, or dominant story, subordinate story, I don't know, lots of different names. Just remember, dominant and one of those like under stories, right? Alternative stories. So the idea is like, because we're interested in power, re-Foucault, we're coming back and we're saying, society is saying this is the dominant discourse, such as like, this is what a woman is supposed to be, and then you have this subordinate story or discourse of all of these other ideas that the person believes, like this is what actually a good woman is, or a good mother is, something like that. And so you're identifying these moments, which he calls either sparkling moments, which is adorable, or unique outcomes. And unique outcomes is the more well-known version, but sparkling moments is more fun. So you identify those elements in the subjugated story, and those are essentially the exceptions, and they challenge the dominant story. And you build off of that, and that's part of the reauthoring process. So when you're just listening to their stories, you're listening for their values, you're listening for their intentions, actually not even what, but how do they describe what they think kind of makes them up and makes their story. And so the more description you can get on that, just like in an actual story, the juicier it is. The more you have to work with, the more, I would say, maneuverability that you have in your co-authoring. So that's why you're after a thick description. You don't want that superficial understanding. If you go back to our lived experience, phenomenology, Heidegger situation, which is postmodern, you really are interested in that depth of the human experience. So the technical terms here are like landscape of action and landscape of consciousness, which was later changed to landscape of identity. But I think you can use either one, you just have to kind of know the history. So these are terms that are directly taken from the literary world. And so landscape of action is just, what's happening, plot, essentially, but it'll be more complicated and I'll talk about it a little bit. And then landscape of consciousness, it is the one that people started thinking of consciousness like, oh, it's conscious versus subconscious, and kind of making it more psychological than it was originally meant to be, because remember, it came from the literary world. So he changed, sorry if you heard Loki in the background, so he changed it to be landscape of identity. That's where you're focusing on the characters, like innermost thoughts and feelings, in the context of the action that's happening. So you're identifying any problem-saturated story. And what you want to do, clearly, is lessen the problem-saturated story so that they have a different story, allowing them more possibilities for their life. Going back to his interest in maps and bicycling all over Australia, it was the idea of having freedom, not necessarily that there was one path and then you'll find one direct alternative path, just that there are multiple ways to get to that destination. So as a therapist practicing narrative, you want to ask why questions, which you should know historically is really cool because most models before White, all models, I'll say most to be safe, really valued how questions, and they were basically like, we don't care about the why. If you're asking why, you're incompetent. We don't care why somebody does this, we just care how they do it and we'll teach them how to do it differently. So it was really a big deal, and I think still is a big deal, to be able to ask why questions and have that be seen as ethical, as competent, and effective. So, jazz hands, that's exciting. I'll talk about that a little bit later, I guess. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, so your not knowing stance is having that approach that fits with the why questions. You're like, I don't know. And remember the same with Harleen Anderson. It's this idea of, I'm an expert in language, or however you want to describe, you're an expert in therapizing, always in quotes, but you are not an expert in your client's life. So that's the important difference. When you're saying a not knowing stance, you're asking why, you're asking for thick descriptions of their life. So an example is love. Like asking somebody what is love is one of those dumb questions where people will say, well, of course you already know what love is. I know what love is. We all know it. But what you're doing by asking these questions is really deconstructing there's your buzzword, by the way, what they see love as. And you're curious and going to be informed by them, which ties into the non-expert stance. The non-expert and the not knowing really are, I don't know, brothers. They're quite aligned. So you are not saying this is the way it is. This is how I see love. You are soliciting their worldview. So similar to collaborative, I would argue that they privilege the client's worldview. And then the last part here is the non-pathologizing, which again goes back to the Foucault influence. You're not saying that there's a problem with the person, that you have to fix it. You're not saying this person is broken, and this ties into like diagnosing. So there's, I would say in the narrative community, they like lean away from diagnosing, but I think lots of people would get mad if I said that they don't diagnose. It's definitely something that they can do, something that they do, but not necessarily something that is encouraged, I would say. I hope that that makes sense, and maybe it'll make a little bit more sense as we go along. But you're, again, opening up possibilities. And if you say somebody is this, you're reinforcing this dominant story that is, in a Foucault influence, oppressing them. And you don't want to be a part of the problem in this way. You want to allow them multiple possibilities. So this is going back to our landscape of action, our landscape of identity, and then the importance of co-authoring. So landscape of action is what's happening, and you want to get as many details as possible about the setting, about the plot, about the characters. And then landscape of identity is, okay, well, when, I don't know, when your Uncle Bob came over, everybody's Bob, whatever, when your Uncle Bob came over for Thanksgiving, and he had like a political outburst, and you know, everybody was yelling at each other, like that's the action. But what is the landscape of identity? Again, going back to this came from the literary world, like what's happening with the individual. So how are you responding? What's going through your mind? And what's the language that you're using to make sense of everything that's happening? So underneath narrative is this belief that we are natural storytellers, that human beings cannot not story, that we live a storied world, and that's how we are able to kind of navigate it. And so the story is critical. So knowing as a therapist the story is critical and how important it is, and then having your client offer their perspective, that's where it comes into, I think the puzzle piece metaphor works okay, of building something together off of what each of you are contributing to, again, find those unique outcomes, highlight, also sparkling moments, same difference, and then highlight an alternative story. So a lot of my presentation is going to be redundant, but as my students know who have had me in practicum, I am redundant for a reason, so that you remember the information and it makes your licensure exam or just life easier. So this is a therapeutic posture chart taken directly from Michael White's workshop notes. And I just wanted to highlight, in case people are asking, that narrative has a decentered influential position. So this is where Minuchin was criticizing it, about saying like that Michael White was leading from behind, yet still manipulative. So you'll find people who agree and disagree with the manipulative aspect, but I feel like it's pretty safe to say that he is leading from behind. So, and because of that leading from behind, again, that's what allows for the co-authoring and the multiple possibilities, but the therapist is also aware of their influence. And it might be unethical if they weren't, if they kind of thought that they weren't influential, then, you know, what's your role that you're even doing? Why are you having a conversation with this person in the first place? Okay, so remembering I should say it differently, remembering. So a lot of narrative has the hyphens to really highlight these differences. And then as you go along and get more in depth into like narrative culture, a lot of people drop the hyphens because you know what you're talking about. But I should really emphasize the hyphenated words and intonation so that you know, as people who are new to narrative, the difference here. So remembering is not recalling information, rather it's focusing on a membership like a club that you belong to. So what's the club and who are the members of the club? And again, you're asking about this so that you can figure out like themes of their story to be able to reorganize that. One of the examples that he uses in maps is my favorite one. I'm only going to read one of the bullet points. What is your guess about what it was like for this neighbor to experience your joining her in this interest in knitting and sewing? Sorry for the typo. And so the character, the client, had already always thought about how important this neighbor was to her, and how the neighbor, they talk about, like, saw different things in her than her family did. So a really important neighbor, important character in her life. And yet she had never really thought about how she herself could have influenced her neighbor. And so this kind of group of belonging in like community changes the story. And it's all identity focused. Like, which group do you belong to comes back to identity. And then I'll read this one quote up top of remembering conversations are shaped by the conception that identity is founded upon an association of life rather than on a core self. Again, that's the maneuverability aspect that you have in being able to reauthor stories with your clients in the first place. This one I am going to let you pause and look at if you want. This is a map that he includes in maps. Again, as I explained, other people were asking, like, how do you do this? And so he created this structure. I really wonder what would have happened if nobody asked him to do that. Would he still have created, like, this chart? Because it's something that I feel like he wouldn't. Guess. I feel like he would have this understanding of where he's coming from, and that would be the map, and that would be the guide, rather than having this more organized sort of chart thing. I don't know. So you can look at that on your own time about the examples, and I'll include another one a little bit later too, another map example. So outsider witness is again connected to that idea of Tom Anderson's like reflecting team. So an outsider witness situation is actually there's an ethical thing to bring up that I may as well tell you about, that Michael White used his old clients and asked them if they would sit in his conversations with new clients and just not say anything, sit and listen, and at the end speak up and say what they heard the other person saying, which is a really cool premise. People have ethical concerns about it, and that's a different conversation. So the outsider witness doesn't have to be with your old clients, but it is this person who is serving witness, right? They are listening to the client's story. And so when you have people listen to your story, they're going to pick out certain themes. And the whole idea is for this to be like really empowering. So this worked well with people who suffered like loss and grief and trauma. Have somebody be able to listen and then retell their story back at the end. I don't know, it was just, it's hard to explain how empowering and helpful that can be for somebody. It's important to know that this is not like complimenting. Like, you would not want your outsider witness to comment back on the story that they heard from the client and say, what a strong person. Like, I really see that this person has been like a hero in their life. That is like super no, because that's a limiting story. Now you've made that person necessarily have to be the hero, and that wasn't coming from them at all, that's coming from you. So this is one of the things that I talk about nicely. No, I criticize in solution-focused therapy of the idea of compliments, because complimenting just doesn't work for me in my personal approach, because I find is more limiting than it is helpful. There's also the secondary aspect of, if you are complimenting someone, like, what does that do for your position, recognizing that you are, as a therapist, in a position of power? Like, now does your client feel like they have to essentially, like, perform for you so that you can, they can get pride points, I guess. They can have some data that you are proud of them, and that's their measure. And now it's not about their story. So we want to keep it in the realm of restorying, because you don't have to change everything in that person's life, but if you change the story, you're changing the trajectory. So again, multiple possibilities. Oh, and the reason why I have what they were drawn to here is because White talks about the, like, catharsis experience. So, like, it's not, how do I explain that? It's not the listener's story. It's just, oh, I was really drawn to this aspect of that person's story. Like, that's what resonated with me. So there was somebody who, their mother had completed suicide, and they were in a session, and somebody was doing the outsider witness situation, and at the end, Michael White asked the outsider witness to speak, as can be expected, and they talked about how they heard that there was, like, a lot of love from the mother. Like, the mother, essentially from the story, seemed to have completed suicide because she loved her child so much, and she thought that the child would be better off. And that's a totally different story than thinking that his mom didn't care about him, and kind of having these feelings of potentially, like, worthlessness. Okay, so the tentative language part is something that I feel like you could incorporate with most models. It's just kinder, I guess I want to say. And it allows you more space to make errors, and also to check in with your client. And the subjunctive stance, like, fits with the tentative language. So what might we say is imagining, like, this world, like, not what are we going to say, like, what might we say, in the same way as, like, it seems is different than, like, it is. So I think those are tying back to the postmodernism, that belief in multiple realities. And then asking permission is really important. Like, do you mind if I ask you about this? This is why I really like narrative as a good fit for trauma. You're just continuing to lead from behind and ask permission the whole time. And then checking in. How is this going for, this should say you. How is this going for you? Getting that client's experience so that you can shift if you want. So these are just a couple of examples of externalization. So again, not combative murder war metaphors necessarily, but like, what was anorexia up to? Or like, what color is your ADHD? Which I used that example earlier actually. So he, I think, said AHD because that's what the kid referred to it as, and in narrative you want to use the client's language. So you're not going to like totalize the problem, like this is the huge big deal problem thing, and this is everything that encompasses it, and then you will like defeat this and your life will be good. Oh good, and I said avoid battle metaphors. Yay. Yeah. So going back to the same idea is that narrows the possibilities for where you can go in your sessions. So if you can kind of like try a little externalization here and there and here and see like what fits for the client, like what is the client picking up on, going back to that outsider witness kind of perspective of what's resonating with them, rather than, again, this kind of like black and white understanding, which would be applicable in modernism, but this is postmodernism. So this externalization example slide, I think, is something that you can like pause and look at. This is what he's talking about. Okay, it is from Maps, good. When he is saying like it's not all of these battle metaphors. So going on strike against the problem, or declining or refusing invitations to cooperate with the problem, or taking your lives out of the hands of the problem, or harnessing the problem. Those are all very different. Oh, educating the problem. That's one I really like. But yeah, pause and read over all of these. And again, realizing that they don't only have to be a battle metaphor. So if somebody says, I don't like narrative because externalization only uses these battle metaphors, that is an improper understanding, I don't know how to say that in a nice way, of externalization and narrative. Here's another map that, that you can use. Again, but it's an example on externalization. Is that it? I feel like that's it. Okay, there's definitely a lot more to say about narrative, but that's definitely going to be our introduction. So thanks for hanging in with me as long as you did. Hopefully this isn't too long of a presentation. If it is, sorry. And extra thanks for hanging out with me. And I will see you in the next video.